Alright, welcome back. This is now going to be part 2 of our lecture series on ancient Rome, and in this lecture we're going to talk about the expansion of the Roman Republic. A quick note before I get into this, usually and a lot of historians will use the word empire to talk about some kind of national entity that starts to expand and where they start to rule over people who are not like them. So for example, Sargon of Akkad. Once the Akkadians take over the Sumerians, Sargon is ruling over not just his own people, the Akkadians, but also a people that are religiously and linguistically and ethnically distinct from them, and so that's when we start to call it an empire. Rome does most of its expanding during the time period that we would call it a republic. So if you remember, from about 750 BC to about 500 BC, Rome is a kingdom, and then in 500 BC-ish, it becomes a republic. So now you have the Senate, eventually you have the Concilium Plebis, you have different governing bodies, different councils, and then it stays a republic until about the year 0, when under Julius Caesar and Caesar Augustus, it transforms into what we're going to call the Roman Empire. And pretty much everyone uses that same vernacular, that it's the Roman Empire from about the year 0 until it falls around the year 500. Confusingly enough, like I said, Rome does most of its expanding during the time period that we would call it a republic. So if we're going to talk about expansion, let's talk first about the Roman military. This would be a Roman soldier over here on the left, and a map of a Roman legion. The Roman legion was very flexible. That was one of the main strengths, is that they had very crystal clear communication between all the different cohorts that made up the legion, and different signalers and message runners and things like that would make sure that every cohort and every individual soldier knew exactly what they were supposed to be doing. And in a year they would raise their legion, and they would use that legion to march around and take care of whatever battles needed to be taken care of. Remember, again from the last lecture, Rome would have two cohorts, and two consuls, and one of those consuls would be responsible for running things at home, tax collection, the building of infrastructure, temples, things like that. And the other consul would be responsible for taking the legion and mopping up whatever mess was happening, let's say up north with the Etruscans, or down south in Magna Graecia. But this legion would be largely composed of these individual soldiers. And if you look at the armor and the shield, and especially the spear of this soldier, you see that he also has a short sword girded on his waist. But look at this spear. This is what's called a pilum, and the Roman pilum is, I think, one of the coolest military innovations of this time period, because if you look at it, it looks like it would be kind of a weak spear, and really the purpose of the pilum is that you would throw that into an enemy's spear, and maybe that sharp edge is able to go through the spear and is able to do some damage into the opponent. That's not 100% what you're after. You're actually looking to lodge this thing into the spear so that the weight on the other end, the heavy bottom part of the pilum, would make your enemy's shield pretty much unusable. And even if they were to put their shield down and try to pull it out, it has that barb in the top, that little pyramid on the iron shank, the top part of it, that would make it really hard to pull out. And so you're probably not going to be able to pull it out, which means that your shield is pretty much useless at this point. You have to just put down your shield and just run in with your sword or your spear or whatever you have, and you're a lot more vulnerable. The legion, was broken up into cohorts. The cohorts could break up into these little tortoise type of units, and like I said, their flexibility, their ability to move very fluidly around the battlefield in a way that a Greek phalanx, or even a lot of trained cavalry, are not going to have that maneuverability component. They have to stay, phalanx especially has to stay rigidly locked together in order to be effective. And so Rome starts out as really just a city, but then they spread out into the middle part of the Apennine Peninsula, what we would call Italy today. But they're not the only dogs there. You have the Celts that are further up to the north. You have the Etruscans that are just slightly north of the Romans. You have the Greeks. The Greeks have started to plant colonies on the southern part of the peninsula, and then you also have Carthage. And Carthage, they're not just stationed here on Sicily and Sardinia. They actually are mainly set up, and even the city of Carthage itself is on the northern coast of Africa. But the Roman century, the Roman legions are able to effectively conquer these people. They're able to take out the major threats of the Celts and the Etruscans and even the Greeks. The Greeks are a difficult foe because they're fighting them in and around the time period when they would have already learned a lot of their tactics from the Alexandrian conquests of Persia. And famously, one of the kings of Greece, his name is Pyrrhus, and he just keeps sending armies over to the Apennine Peninsula, to Italy, to try to defeat the Romans, and he defeats them in battle after battle after battle. But the victories that go to him, to the king of Greece, wind up costing him more than the land winds up being worth. And so even today we have the phrase, we call it a Pyrrhic victory, when you may have won, but you've just spent far too much of your resources and your manpower on a battle that might not have been worth fighting. We still call that a Pyrrhic victory today. But there's this other power, and I want to actually back up a little bit before I talk about Carthage to talk about where they come from. The Carthaginians have their genesis in a people that are called the Phoenicians. If you go all the way to the east of the Mediterranean, in the Levant, there's a group of people called the Phoenicians. In the Bible, if you ever read anything about the cities of Tyre and Sidon, these would have been the major hubs of power, the HQ of the Phoenician people. And the Phoenician people are not very much a warlike people, but they're very into trading. They have their gods. These gods are mentioned in the Bible, especially Baal is mentioned all throughout the Old Testament, and that's the main god of the Phoenicians. They do child sacrifices to their gods and everything like that. But the Phoenicians plant colonies all around the northern coast of Africa, even all the way out to Iberia, what we would today call Spain, Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and other islands in the Mediterranean. And what makes them so effective at trading is that they have taken the Egyptian hieroglyphic language and they've simplified it into a series of about 24 markings, 24 letters, into an alphabet that they can use for their language. They're a Semitic people, so they would have a Semitic language. But then also other people start to adopt this. The Greeks, even, being a Indo-European group of people, they adopt the same markings and they wind up adapting it to their alphabet. The Romans, who speak Latin, they wind up adopting these markings. And so this tool of the alphabet, the Phoenician alphabet, allows them to trade very effectively with people. They can write down their languages in a way and be able to pass information and therefore pass goods more effectively between each other. And so they become incredibly wealthy, and the most important of the Phoenician colonies that they plant is Carthage itself. So kind of like how you would say that Rome is part of Greece's sphere of influence. You think of the Roman gods and the Greek gods being similar, or just how Greco-Roman history is kind of solidified in our mind as one entity today. In the same way, the Phoenicians and the Carthaginians would have been joined at the hip culturally, linguistically, ethnically, even religiously. The Phoenicians worshipped Baal. The main god of the Carthaginians is named Baal-Hamon, and he's essentially a fusion of the Phoenician god Baal with a other North African Hammon, and you still have the sacrifice of your firstborn son going to the Carthaginian, happening in Carthage, things like that. But like I said, the Phoenicians and the Carthaginians, they're not necessarily a warfaring people so much as they're a seafaring and trading people. And so if you were to look at a map of the Mediterranean, the Western Mediterranean, you can see that Rome has conquered the Apennine Peninsula at this point. So the Etruscans and the Celts and the Grecians and even other peoples have fallen under the control of the Romans. So the Romans control the peninsula. But outside of that peninsula, I would even say the most powerful nation, or the most powerful group of people that are on the Mediterranean at this point are not the Romans. They are the Carthaginians. But because Rome is expansionistic, it means that once they conquer one group of people, then if you were to go beyond that to the next border, you just wind up with more problems. And so the main area of conflict occurs whenever you have these Greek people on the island of Sicily, the Syracusans, and they're fighting off a group of tribes that are there, and they call on both the Romans and the Carthaginians for help. Both the Romans and Carthaginians send help, and then there winds up being, I won't even just say miscommunications, but basically egos and challenges that are issued to each other, and they wind up fighting. And this is what winds up becoming the first in a series of 3, what are called the Punic Wars. So they're called the Punic Wars because of the Latin word for the Carthaginians. They call them Punic or Punic, like that's where we get the word Phoenician from. Anyway, so this sets off the first of the Punic Wars, and like I said, I mean, if you just look at this map, Rome is a land-based power. They have never had to fight a naval military expedition before, and the navy is Carthage's expertise. That's what they control, kind of like the Greeks would have been said to have controlled the seas over in the eastern Mediterranean. The Carthaginians definitely rule the waves out here on the western Mediterranean. And so the Romans don't even have a navy. They don't have really ships of that kind. And so what they do is they find a couple of shipwrecked Carthaginian triremes, and what are also called quinqueremes, and they reverse engineer them. They're able to build, over the course of just the first war, they build almost 1,000 of these ships. But even though they're able to build the ships, they're still not as adept at using these ships as the Carthaginians. They don't sail as deftly as the Carthaginians do. And the Romans understand this about themselves, and so what they do is they build what's called a corvus. It's essentially a bridge that they would slam down between their ship and the enemy ship whenever they got close. Remember, the way you would fight triremes against each other is that you would just try to ram them against each other. Well, now, whenever the enemy ship gets close, you just slam one of these bridges down, and then you fight it as though it's a land-based battle. You just march your troops across, and then they have to fight and defeat the enemies. And so because of this, they're relatively effective, even though more than half of the ships that they lose during this war, they lose just to bad weather. But they're able to land in North Africa and actually march toward Carthage. The Carthaginians are kind of freaking out about this. They hire a Spartan general named Xanthippus to come kind of coach them in being able to stave off the Romans. And the Romans essentially wind up going home, and instead of giving it their all to just exterminate the Carthaginians right then and there, they wind up securing favorable wind conditions and a treaty that basically says that they're going to be paid back reparations for all of the ships and all the lives that they've been lost. They're going to be paid back in silver, and then they're also going to get control of these 3 major islands in the Mediterranean. So now all of Sicily, all of Sardinia, and all of Corsica wind up belonging to the Romans. So that's a major loss for the Carthaginians. And so the Carthaginians have lost the first of these wars. The second Punic War is definitely the one that people spend the most time on, and it's the most fascinating. It starts off with a guy, a Carthaginian general, whose name is Hamilcar Barca. And Hamilcar Barca is frustrated because even, he's a Carthaginian, he's on the side that lost, but he himself never lost a battle, and his men are very loyal to him, and yet he finds himself at the end of this war in this political game where he's not really able to be as effective as he feels like he needs to be. He wants revenge against the Romans. He wants to be able to, bring back the lost valor of Carthage. And basically what he does is, instead of trying to, he sees trying to win the political game in the city of Carthage as a lost cause. And so he says, hey guys, I'm a great general. You know what? I'm going to do you guys a favor. I'm going to leave. That way you don't have to be, arguing with me over here. I'm going to go out to Spain, where we already have some colonies over there, and I'm just going to conquer a huge part of Spain. They would have called this the Iberian Peninsula. I'm going to conquer more of these Celtic tribes out there. There's massive silver deposits out there, and I'm going to just, take control of all this silver, mine the silver out of this, enslave the Celts, mine all of the silver out of Iberia, and I'll send it to the Romans, and then our debt against the Romans will be paid. And, they seem to think that that's agreeable, and he brings with him his 9-year-old son, whose name is Hannibal. So Hamilcar Barca is the father, and Hannibal is his son, and Hamilcar makes his son Hannibal take an oath, a blood oath, to Baal, at the age of 9, that he will never be a friend of the Romans, or basically that he will, his life's mission is going to be the destruction of the Romans. He trains him at war from a young age. So you have this guy who's trained, Hannibal has every advantage. He has a massive brain. He's considered one of the greatest generals and tacticians in all of ancient history. He also has all of the wealth he could ever desire because his father has gone out here to control these silver mines and pay off the Romans, sure, but you can also build a giant military. And then he has a singleness of purpose. He considers his life's one purpose to avenge his father and avenge his people, the Carthaginians, against the menace, the scourge of the Romans. And so with that, he raises his army. He has war elephants and mostly his own men, and he has some Celts at this point. Eventually he's going to also conscript or hire Numidian cavalry and Macedonian infantrymen and things like this. But basically he does what's unexpected. The Romans are not expecting that the Carthaginians would try to approach them over land, because on the northern part of the Apennine Peninsula you have the Alps, and those are considered to be basically an impenetrable wall. I mean, if you think of why was Switzerland able to be neutral in both world wars, and even a lot of history before and after that, it's because they're surrounded by the Alps. Well, the Romans figured that if the Carthaginians are going to try anything sneaky, that they're going to approach by sea. The Carthaginians are a seafaring people after all. Because Hannibal knows this, he decides instead that he's going to march an army over the Alps. And some numbers would say that when he starts out, when he leaves the Iberian Peninsula, what today would be Spain, he has over 100,000 troops, but by the time he actually gets into Italy proper, he has only about 26,000 of them left. So, almost 3/4, or even if we just say half to 3/4 of his army has died before he even shows up in the battlefield, just because of the dangers of crossing the Alps and having to do so in winter, just because that's when he winds up being able to get there. While he's in Italy, he makes it his duty to crisscross the Italian peninsula and to just wreak as much havoc as possible. He spends 15 years here. He winds up recruiting and paying off more of the Celts while he's there. The Celts obviously hate the Romans. They consider themselves a conquered people. And so, he recruits a lot of them. He uses his money to pay for Celtic soldiers, for Numidian cavalry, for even for Macedonians to come over and to, put a stop to the growth of Rome that everybody agrees is a problem in the Mediterranean bases. And in 15 years, he has no fewer than 15 military wins and 0 losses. So he uses stealth, he uses deception, he uses the massive amount of money at his disposal, and he wins some major battles. The most notable of these battles is the Battle of Cannae. Cannae is just considered an absolute masterpiece of warfare at the hands of Hannibal, whenever he's able to envelop a Roman army that is more than twice his size, and to surround them. So basically he has the men at the middle, at the center point of his own battle lines, start to draw backward and march backward, so that the Romans wind up funneling themselves into a position where they're surrounded by the Carthaginians. And in one day at the Battle of Cannae, the Roman army loses more men than all of America lost in 20 years in the Vietnam War. Over 60,000, the numbers are somewhere between 60 and 80,000 Romans died just in that one day. And so you have all of these Roman generals. You have a man named Scipio the Elder, you have a man named Fabian, you have a man named Vero, and in 15 years, Rome is throwing its best minds, its best generals after this guy, and they're not really able to defeat him. In fact, Fabian is usually thought of as the most effective of these 3 men, and his tactic is that he just holds his army at arm's length away from Hannibal's army, and he shadows them, and he follows them around, and he never engages in combat with them, but he keeps them in a position where they have to just be ready at all times, and because he knows that if he's going to march up on Hannibal and his army, that he's going to lose. And the Roman Senate and the Roman people hate this. They find it cowardly. That's actually when they take him out. They put Vero in, and Vero winds up losing at the Battle of Cannae. But Hannibal is just completely undefeated the entire time that he's on the Apennine Peninsula, the entire time that he's in Rome's home field for over 15 years. He's there, and he doesn't lose a single battle. Unfortunately, while he has been doing all of this winning over in Italy, there's another man, a younger man, Scipio the Younger, son of Scipio the Elder, and he's actually eventually going to be known as Scipio Africanus. He has left Rome and he has gone over to Iberia, and he has been wreaking havoc in Iberia, the same way that Hannibal has been wreaking havoc over in Rome, in Italy. He goes over to Spain, and he has been just tearing this place up. All of these cities, you have what's called New Carthage. Hamilcar Barca had taken control of this city that's basically like a new hub or a new headquarters for Carthaginian culture. Hamilcar Barca had also planted a city that's called Barcelona, that we would call it today. Scipio the Younger has also been able to take control over all of that, and now he takes his Roman army and he marches it down into North Africa and east over to Carthage. And because of this, Hannibal is summoned to leave Italy after being in Italy for 15 years. Remember, he left Carthage when he was 9 years old. He has not seen this place since he was a little boy. And he is summoned back with his army to Carthage to fight against Scipio Africanus. Scipio Africanus, or Scipio the Younger, he has been studying Hannibal's tactics, and so at the Battle of Zama, he uses a lot of Hannibal's tactics against him and is able to get the victory. One of the other things that people like to point out, especially here at the Battle of Zama, is that the Romans are unified. They're unified especially linguistically. If your commander gives you or signals things to you, you understand them. If he sends a messenger to you speaking in Latin, everybody's able to understand him. Whereas with Hannibal, he might speak a Semitic language of the Carthaginians, but he's also speaking to Celts. He's speaking to Macedonians. He's speaking to Numidians. And so if he barks out orders, these orders have to be translated into a bunch of different languages by people who may or may not share a fighting style. They may or may not consider themselves really loyal to the cause. Remember, these are people who are fighting for money, not so much the love of their homeland or the survival of their people or something like that. So because of this, Scipio the Younger is able to best Hannibal, is able to defeat him. Hannibal actually winds up having to flee, and the Battle of Zama is considered the end of the Second Punic War. Again, this is a victory by the Romans, and now they not only control the islands of Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica, but they control Spain, or the Iberian Peninsula, and the northern coast of Africa. They have not destroyed Carthage at this point, and a lot of Romans wanted to. There's a famous Roman senator who he would end all of his speeches saying Carthago delenda est, which is whatever maybe I'm talking about tax reform, or I'm talking about granting rights or taking rights away from this or that group of people. But every speech that he gave for years, he would say, and don't forget, we have to destroy Carthage. We have to completely obliterate that people so that they never, they don't even exist as a people anymore. But that doesn't happen quite yet. Some people think that the Romans, the Senate, decides to keep them alive so that they can continue to pay this war debt to them, and kind of as a humiliation ritual, keep them alive long enough to bleed them out. But regardless, Rome turns her attention away from Carthage over to the east. And remember these four kingdoms that Alexander's empire winds up being divided into. They do war against the Macedonians because the Macedonians had been teaming up with Hannibal. So basically they say, yeah, you were right, we were a threat, but you chose the wrong side. Maybe you should have allied yourselves with us, but because you allied yourself with Hannibal and he's defeated, they wind up going into Macedonia and conquering Macedonia and the Achaean League, what would be Greece. And then, what I think is actually a pretty funny story, you have this other king just to the east, king of the kingdom of Pergamon, and he sees what's going on, and he sends a message to the Romans that says, hey, I know that if you were to march over here, you would defeat me as well. You would, you defeated the Carthaginians, you defeated the Etruscans and the Celts and now the Macedonians. I know that the people of Pergamon do not stand a chance against you. Just let me live out my life. I don't have any kids, and then when I die, instead of bequeathing my crown to some nephew or something like that, I'll just give it to you. And the Romans are willing to accept this deal. And so because of that, Macedonia and Pergamon, the western part of the Anatolian Peninsula, also come under the control of Rome. And then finally, Rome comes back to Carthage once they've mopped up those problems, and they set their sights back on the city of Carthage itself in what's called the Third Punic War, but it's really not a war so much as it's just an extermination campaign. By some accounts, the Romans show up and they say, hey, we don't have to kill all of you. Basically, what you could do is you could pick up this city brick by brick and move it about 200 miles south into the desert and rebuild the city. This port city that thrives on, seafaring and naval trade. You could build that. You could rebuild your city in the middle of the desert, and we will not kill all of you. The Carthaginians obviously understand that this is not really a deal, and they decide to fight to the death. And as a result, Carthage is destroyed so completely by the Romans that by some accounts you can't even find out exactly where it is today. Some people would say that they salted the earth. The Romans salted the earth so that crops wouldn't grow there. If they had, that would make it a little bit easier to find these days. So some people think that was just like an exaggeration or part of the tale. But regardless, the city of Carthage is completely obliterated. Like I said, it's not even 100% sure where in Tunisia, in North Africa, that city could be found today. But the Romans are now masters of pretty much the entire western part and a lot of the eastern part of the Mediterranean. They've conquered Iberia, they've conquered the northern coast of Africa, they've conquered the Apennine Peninsula, Greece, the western part of Anatolia. Really the only two of the Alexandrian kingdoms that exist at this point are the Seleucid Persian Empire and Ptolemaic Egypt. And those are going, at least the Mediterranean parts of those kingdoms are going to fall under Roman control shortly thereafter. But what happens is that Rome winds up in a position where they have a lot of new land, which has a capacity to create a lot of new bread, a lot of new wealth or gold, and they have a lot of new conquered peoples that they're going to subjugate. They're going to turn into slaves. And so this is an opportunity for Rome to capitalize on a glut of new wealth, and they could use it well or they could use it poorly. But this is where we start to turn our attention to the adage that some people talk about how strong men create good times create weak men create bad times create strong men, and the cycle repeats over and over and over and over. So you think of these strong men like Scipio the Younger. You think of these Roman generals who have fought through thick and thin. They have refused, after years, after over a decade of just losing and losing and losing, they refuse to admit defeat. They refuse to surrender. And so because of that, they overcome. And now you have all of this wealth. But now we're going to enter into a period of what sometimes is called decadence, just this time of opulence where there's a lot of wealth, not necessarily in the hands of everybody, but at least in the hands of the upper echelons, the people who start to call themselves the optimates, the elites, and because of that, the ruling elites of Rome become weak, and it's going to set Rome up for, let's just say, bad times, about 100 years of civil wars. And so we'll talk about that more in our next episode. But for now, thank you so much for watching. Hope you have a blessed day.